We are welcoming Dr. Ashley Walker this morning. And as you guys can see on the screen, there is a pre-grand round survey that we are being asked to complete. So there's just a few questions there. The link is in the chat if people want to link to that as we're doing our introduction, and then we will get started. It sounds like we're going to have a very interactive session today. So it would be good for people to be ready to go into breakout groups and to be engaged and maybe a little less passively listening than you might normally plan on. And yeah, I think it's going to be an exciting morning. So for our land acknowledgement, we usually start with mentioning that University of Washington and Seattle Children's Psychiatry are situated on the traditional land of the first people of Seattle, the Coast Salish people of this land, the land which touches the shared waters of all tribes and bands within the Duwamish, Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. We honor with gratitude the land itself and the Native American tribes and bands. We also want to affirm the commitment of Seattle Children's Psychiatry Program of addressing the role of privilege and oppression in the lives of our patients and our employees, and to strive to be anti-racist by improving care for groups with less privilege, including Black, Hispanic, and individuals of Asian Pacific heritage. We also usually put up, as most of you know, on the left-hand side of the screen is the Real Rent Duwamish, kind of a screenshot from their webpage. And the idea is not just to do a land acknowledgement, but also to give people an opportunity for some sort of actionable step that you could take. So Real Rent Duwamish is a website where you can sign up to actually make a contribution to the Duwamish tribe, in a sense, paying rent for the land that you're using. We also want to mention that this is Native American Heritage Month, and definitely acknowledge that for the next month, we will be showing our gratitude and our acknowledgement to Native Americans through maybe some more in-depth exploration and acknowledgement of their heritage. So those are the things that we want to acknowledge starting off our grand rounds. So Shannon, if you want to take it away and do a bit more of a formal introduction of our speaker, that would be great.
Good morning, everybody. It's really my honor and privilege to introduce our grand round speaker today. We are really fortunate to welcome Dr. Ashley Walker to speak with us about some exciting and important advances in psychiatry education. And as a clinician educator myself, I'm really thrilled for this grand round. Dr. Walker is the Psychiatry Residency Training Director and an Associate Professor in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Oklahoma in Tulsa. She's an alumna of Rice University, where she studied both mathematics and psychology, and med school at the University of Texas Southwestern in Dallas. She joined the University of Oklahoma for psychiatry residency training, and I believe has remained at that institution ever since. So Dr. Walker is the co-chair of the National Neuroscience Curriculum Initiative, NNCI, which is a project that emerged from ADPERT, which is the National Psychiatry Training Director Association, based on the recognition of the many challenges that psychiatry training programs face in effectively teaching neuroscience. And as a side note, we also recognize and have faced those challenges here and look forward to hearing more about this. The NNCI group has had noteworthy accomplishments in creating teaching resources to make neuroscience core concepts accessible and clinically relevant using principles of adult learning. And I learned from the NNCI website that over 1,000 US cities and over 100 countries have visited the site, which really speaks to the global appetite and importance of this work. Dr. Walker is also the co-chair of the National Anti-Racism in Medicine Curriculum Coalition. I'll quote directly from their website, because they said it better than I could, that this group is committed to making anti-racism a core part of medical training, so the next generation of physicians and scientists have the critical skills, knowledge, and attitudes to bring about meaningful social change. We advocate for anti-racism competencies to be a salient and integrated aspect of medical training. We develop high-quality educational resources to make essential concepts in anti-racism accessible and clinically relevant. In summary, Dr. Walker is a skilled and innovative clinician, educator, and scholar who's leading important advances in psychiatry and medical training, specifically in the areas of neurosciences and anti-racism. And I'm confident that our audience here is as excited to learn more about these innovations as I am. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Ashley Walker.
Thank you so much for that introduction. If you have not completed the pre-survey, you can still go on there. The link is in the chat. As we said, this is an interactive session. If you want to peel off now before we get to any interactive parts, that is perfectly fine. Just please try to peel off before we go to the small group discussion breakout so that we don't assign you to a breakout and then you're not in there. I also would like to acknowledge that I'm speaking today from Tulsa, Oklahoma. Oklahoma is home to 39 tribal nations as a result of settler and colonial policies and violence designed to assimilate Native people. And the city of Tulsa, where I'm in, is within the tribal boundaries of 3 of these nations: the Cherokee Nation, the Muscogee Creek Nation, and the Osage Nation. These tribes are still present on this land today, and I honor the work they're doing for their citizens. Today, I'm presenting on behalf of both the NNCI and the NAMCC. So our hope is that we will spend the majority of the time talking about the NNCI. We will get to experience an NNCI module, and then we will kind of transition towards the end into a brief overview of what the NAMCC is doing. I think it's pretty obvious, like the similarities between them, but I think we will also have time to do a brief module from the NAMCC, which I'm really excited that y'all get a snippet of that as well. Each of those times, we're going to kind of watch a brief video and then have an interactive discussion in small groups. So that's going to be part of the interactivity. I also invite people to ask questions throughout, type them into the chat. Whatever works for you is fine. I'm monitoring the chat. I'll be posting information into the chat as well throughout the presentation. So hopefully you're able to access that information there. I do receive funds from these sources via the NNCI and the NAMCC. So you've heard a little bit about me, although I like to present a little bit more personal information usually when I'm giving bios. So I am a white cisgender heterosexual woman. I was born and raised, I've always lived in the South. I have 2 kids. I recently started playing tennis again. I am an inpatient psychiatrist at a state hospital. And at one point, a very, very brief point in time, I was a violinist too. But what I am most definitely not is a neuroscientist. In fact, the reason that I was invited to join the NNCI was specifically because I could provide input as somebody from an institution that had no significant neuroscience resources, and who myself, I am not a neuroscientist and don't have that perspective. I am a graduate of my own program, and so I can for sure tell you that when I was a resident here, neuroscience lectures consisted of a lot of stuff that looked like this. And I see nods, yes. Other people have had this too. And a lot of stuff that looked like this, right? Yes, looks familiar. Thank you, Shannon. And what I looked like was this. So when I was a resident in my program, when I was in a neuroscience lecture, I would basically find any excuse to get up and leave the lecture room, go to the bathroom, go find something to talk about with the program coordinator, whatever I needed to do to get out of there. It was so boring. My eyes would glaze over. I didn't know what they were talking about. It didn't seem relevant to me. And so as a result of all this, I graduated residency really without much knowledge in neuroscience. With pretty poor appreciation for how neuroscience could be relevant to my clinical work. And I felt intimidated whenever these kind of topics were brought up. Unfortunately, little did I know that in my first year as faculty, I would be introduced to this.
Hello, my name is Josh Gordon from Columbia University, and I'm going to show you how to build your brain out of Play-Doh.
Ooh, sorry. So of all the modules that we've produced in the NNCI, this Play-Doh brain, which is actually, that's just like a encapsulation of it, but the module itself has been by far and away the most popular module that we've done. So that actually came about in 2014. And at the NNCI, all of our learning modules are designed to be engaging and interactive, whether they're delivered in a classroom, a clinic, or just for self-study. So I would never come to you, especially on behalf of the NNCI, and just deliver a set of text-heavy slides that I'm reading off of. So this is going to be engaging, as we said. So I started the session with an assessment and asked you about a case of a patient who was using IV heroin to the point of developing endocarditis. And what I hoped that you gained from doing that assessment was so that you could see what your own pre-existing knowledge and attitudes were on this subject. And I asked you to think about how you would talk to the primary care team about that patient and what kind of treatment you would recommend. And again, it's okay if you didn't get to complete it. But the sad story is that in this country, we now have more than 100,000 people per year dying of drug overdoses, and the vast majority of these are related to opioids, which is more than twice the number from 2014 when the NNCI first started publishing. And despite this mortality rate, 80 to 90% of patients who have opioid use disorder do not receive standard of care, life-saving medications for this disorder. So I would like you to just reflect for a moment to yourself, what factors do you think contribute to this disparity? Why are people, we know 100,000 people are dying and they're not getting standard of care meds that can save their lives? Feel free to think about why you think that might be. You can put it in the chat or just hold on to your thought for the moment. See a lot of stigmas there. Yes, stigmas and assumptions. So a lot of our history informs the way we think about things today, even if we, as I think many psychiatrists go into psychiatry wanting to decrease stigma, it is still something that still has quite a firm hold on us. Stigma, lack of access, etc. So lots of disparities, yes. So to help us think through this further and add a neuroscience lens to this problem, we're going to watch a 10-minute video on the hidden side of addiction. So please let me know if it's not coming through, but I hope that it will be fine.
I'm on a road trip with my partner through the American West. The windows are down, got music playing, and I'd love to tell you that it's Pink Floyd or Led Zeppelin, but it's Miley Cyrus. We are living the dream of the American road trip, and everything is perfect. And I see that the next exit is pretty far away. And I start thinking that that large soda with lunch wasn't the best idea. My body starts to feel uncomfortable. I'm noticing my heart racing, and my girlfriend knows something's up because we go from idle chit chat to me snapping back at everything she says. She's having none of it. The road starts to feel like it's closing in, and pretty soon I'm in full blown distress. All I'm doing is waiting for the next sign, trying not to think of anything that's going to make this worse. Finally, my salvation arrives. So I finish my business and we get back out onto the road. And my girlfriend shoots me this look like she's not sure who just got back into the car. Is it Bruce Banner or is it the Irritable Hulk? And I'm struggling. Like, what just happened to me? How did these bodily sensations totally change the way that I interacted with the world? And I realized, as we kept driving, that in its own weird way, my bladder ordeal was similar to a problem that I worked on in graduate school. A problem related to the neurobiology of addiction. And believe me, I spent a lot of time thinking about this. And at the time, it seemed really important to study addiction and opioid use disorder in particular, because 30,000 people were dying every year from opioid overdoses. But what we've seen since is it's gotten so much worse, with over 100,000 people dying from April 2020 to April 2021. So how do we as psychiatrists think about this problem? One in which we've so obviously failed to address, and what is it going to take for us to make real progress? The earliest concepts of addiction started with Freud and psychoanalysis, whose basic idea was that unresolved early conflict leads to drug use. And this is an idea that naturally segues into a moral model that people are to blame for choosing to use. Whatever benefits exist for analysis fall short here. It wasn't until the 1970s that biology began to catch up. The first key discovery was that of the mu opioid receptor. For the first time, neuroscientists could show that morphine and other opioids bind to this G protein coupled receptor, leading to downstream signaling in neurons. This led to an explosion in scientific inquiry into how these receptors work. And it turns out that some mu opioid receptors are located presynaptically in the ventral tegmental area, and through a complicated pathway lead to increased dopamine release in the nucleus accumbens, which at the time was thought of as the brain's reward center. This was crucial in showing that addiction is a brain disease, but that reward pathway is only part of the story, because there's a whole other side to addiction. I'm about to show you a graph. On the x-axis is time, and on the y-axis is some measure of how a person is feeling. And on the bottom is when we're feeling sad, down, or even a little bit irritable. And on the top is when we're feeling good. And I want you to know that we scour the internet for hours. This is the happiest image that exists of Jack Nicholson. So I want you to imagine that Jack goes to his primary care doctor for back pain, and his doc prescribes an opioid. So Jack takes it, and pretty soon he feels better. But what's happening in his brain at this moment? Part of this is what we've already talked about. Opioids bind to their receptors, leading to increased dopamine release in the accumbens, in that reward pathway. But there's more happening here. At the same time that dopamine is being released, this little almond-shaped brain structure located in the temporal lobe called the amygdala, together with other brain regions like the hippocampus and parts of the cortex, is helping us to detect important things in the environment, both internally and externally, and to consolidate memories. A core piece of this circuitry, the basolateral amygdala, is a part of the brain that tells us what we should pay attention to. So when Jack first gets that opioid, his brain says, "This feels great. Pay attention." This is conditioned learning, learning that the drug is rewarding, that it makes us feel better. But what comes up must come down, and Jack's in pain again. Just like there were cells in the amygdala that signaled reward, there are other cells here that are sending signals that he's in distress. They're screaming, "Pay attention." And these distress signaling cells can rapidly mobilize resources with the goal of getting us out of that stressful situation. They do this by signaling to another region of the amygdala, the central amygdala, which then sends projections out to other brain areas that can lead to the physical effects that accompany distress and withdrawal, like increased heart rate, shallow breathing, increased blood pressure, increased flow to our muscles. And the end result is that this neurobiological signal becomes manifest as a whole body experience of distress. And this is the same system that's activated by silly things, like my bladder emergency, by really serious things, like running from a bear. And regardless, our brains are screaming, "Pay attention and find a way to deal with this." And now this system has been hijacked. Because when Jack takes the drug, all of that distress goes away. And his brain and his body learn that the drug not only signals reward, but it relieves distress. So Jack takes the drug, and of course he feels better. But the effects wear off, and that all-consuming distress, it's back. And now Jack has learned, and this is physically coded into the amygdala, that the drug makes it all go away. And each time this cycle repeats, that association gets stronger and stronger. And notice that each time the rewarding aspect is getting smaller, while those negative feelings get even more intense. For 50 years, we thought that addiction was a disease of reward. But it's not just reward. As this cycle repeats, our brains have learned that drugs relieve distress. This is the hidden side of addiction. The side that we as clinicians and scientists didn't see for decades. The feeling that nothing else in the world can exist until you relieve that distress, and opioids are the thing that relieve. This is a cycle that's led to 100,000 deaths in the past year. And of course, there are many other factors involved, sociologically and structurally, that are outside the scope of this talk. But the fact is, We as clinicians need to be able to intervene before this curve bottoms out. And we can intervene and change this course and help people to feel better. Our hope is that with short-term sobriety and support, over time, we can get people back up. But we know, even when we're feeling better, life has a way of throwing us curveballs. For whatever reason, we find ourselves feeling down again. And here's the problem with opioid use disorder. No matter how much time has passed, no matter how long we've been sober, our brain is still keeping score. And it remembers that opioids relieve distress. This critical point, this hidden side of addiction, this is why we need a plan not just for short-term detox, not just for 30-day rehab stays, but a comprehensive long-term plan that helps people to sustain recovery. The first item of that plan needs to be medications, because we know that medications save lives. And the way these medications work is by binding to that mu opioid receptor and keeping this curve from bottoming out. They vastly decrease the likelihood of overdose deaths. And at the same time, they're also thought to help keep those negative feelings that drive drug use in check. If we can also engage people in therapy with community support to help build healthy coping strategies, then we can maximize our chances of success. My road trip turned out to be more than I bargained for. My silly story about a full bladder is also a story about the pathways that drive our behavior, how our brain and our body can come together to produce these powerful signals of distress, and how opioids can become the only way to escape that distress. It's only by fully understanding these hidden pathways that we can help people on their road to recovery. Thank you.
All right. So what I'd like to do now is to move into breakout rooms, and I have two questions to think about in your small group. I've put them in the chat as well. The first is, what did you learn from this video? And the second is, what is one factor contributing to 80 to 90% of patients with opioid use disorder not getting life-saving medications? So we'll give about 6 or 7 minutes in this first one. Okay, I hope that that was a good discussion. Is there anything anybody would like to share from your group discussion? Any key takeaways or interesting points that y'all discussed?
In my group, we were talking about this might be the brain activity might be a fun activity for kids on the PBMU to do and learn their brains better. And all of us, but I thought that would be kind of fun.
Yes, and there's the Play-Doh brain, yes, is really good. There's also a couple NNCI modules on cookie brains. So you can get like cookie cutters that of different cross sections of the brain, and there's facilitator guides on there of like how to, use cookie icing to like color the brain and that sort of thing. That would be another fun kid one. And there's a cookie brain. I think there's a sagittal and a coronal section, and then there's also a neuron that you can do. Carrie?
We spent a great deal of time in our group talking about different ableisms, and we're fortunate to have someone who's deaf in our breakout group, and noticed that the video didn't have closed captions.
Yes.
And just wanted to highlight that as yet another thing that we all, us hearing folks, forget, and really wanted to honor our colleague who needs that, and really appreciate that. That's a good reminder.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Yes. I'm not sure if I can turn it on, but if I did it in the future, sometimes what I'll do is just post into the chat the script from a video.
And I think it just highlights one of those examples of when we're not thinking from someone else's perspective, such as from someone, this gentleman's perspective who has this addiction, that we might miss important ways of reaching that person and communicating in a way that they feel seen and heard and respected.
Yes, excellent points. Good. So I hope that y'all kind of got to these points, that the way that we have traditionally done things, and the historic and even our current kind of models of ways of doing and thinking about things, whether that's related to how we give a presentation or how we think about addiction, can often be wrong and harmful. Hopefully the takeaway from the neuroscience perspective from the video is that the current and historic moral model of addiction, focusing on reward and motivation, is not helpful. It prevents us from moving forward and taking care of people in the best ways that we can. And hopefully we can bring in a new perspective on addiction, which is that negative affect is what's driving a lot of addiction behaviors. So one of the things that we highlight a lot at the NNCI is making modules that are based on principles of adult learning. So I wanted to go through a few of these for you, and I will put them into the chat as well. So the first is that of self-direction. So this can be viewed as organizing your teaching and learning in a way that the learning tasks are primarily within the learner's control. So one of my favorite quotes is that learning results from what the student does and thinks, and only from what the student does and thinks. The teacher can advance learning only by influencing what the student does to learn. Another principle is that of constructivism, which is that learners basically construct their knowledge on a basis of what they already know. So whatever you know coming in, whatever you're going to get out of a learning session is just building on that. So people come in with different baseline amounts of knowledge and are going to get different things and have different needs from an individual learning session. Making topics relevant to real life problems, things that the learners are actually going to see, will help the concepts stick. Number 4 relates to people's judgments of their own abilities to deal with different situations. So if you're coming into an unfamiliar or difficult situation and you're feeling kind of anxious or nervous, you could either view that as excitement, right? Oh, this is like really cool and new, and I'm going to get to do something I haven't done before. Or you could view it with distress, right? Like this is something that I'm dreading, that's going to be bad and hard, and I'm not going to like it, right? So you can, that difference in how you view your own self-efficacy makes a difference in how much you get out of a learning situation. Reflective practice can occur in both in the moment activities as well as later on in debriefing. So this could be debriefing with peers. It could be getting feedback from other learners. It could be individually keeping your own journal to facilitate your own reflection on concepts. But those sorts of reflective practices help learning sink in. And then finally, what we hope to do is model these principles as educators, because people often teach the way that they were taught. So once I started implementing principles of adult learning using NNCI materials with my own residents, I've actually seen that those who have become faculty also do those things in their own teaching. So I'm wondering if anyone can say aloud or put into the chat, which of these principles has stood out to you today so far? 2, so constructivism, so we're all starting at different places. Reflection, I'm hopefully doing 6. I'm glad somebody thinks that I am. 2, 6, 4, 3, 5. Good. So we're seeing most of these modeled here. Perfect. And what I'm also wondering is, we know that not all teaching sessions utilize principles of adult learning, or may not do it fully or well. But other than that, what other ways can you think of that make it difficult to teach topics like neuroscience? What other barriers, or what else is getting in our way? The complexity, a lot of jargon. So I take that to mean like it's a lot of stuff that the teachers weren't taught before. So it feels very unfamiliar for somebody trying to teach it. And that makes it even harder for the learner. So constructivism, so people kind of coming in with vastly different amounts of pre-existing neuroscience knowledge, the anxiety that it provokes, a lack of relevance, so it's not being linked. So maybe it's difficult to see how these things that are being done by neuroscience researchers, in labs and with, animal models or things like that, may be hard to see how that translates into our actual clinical practice. Yes, good. So you're kind of starting to see like all these difficulties that go in to teaching neuroscience. So we're going to kind of talk about some of those as well as a few others that the NNCI has tried to address. So just looking at one of our psychiatric staples, so depression. So depression remains the leading cause of disability worldwide. And in the US last year, more than 40,000 people died from suicide. And worldwide, that number is about 800,000. So if we just think about how we're treating depression, we have 70 years of medications that look like this. They all act through the monoaminergic system, and they really don't work as nearly as well as we would like. So depending on how you add it up, about a third or more of patients won't respond to these treatments. But thanks to modern research, this is finally beginning to change. We now have ketamine, which is a novel rapid-acting treatment working through the glutamatergic system and involving BDNF. As well as brexanolone for postpartum depression, which is arguably the first effective psychotropic medication to be prospectively developed based on our understanding of the underlying neurobiology. And all of this is paving the way for precision psychiatry. So now that we're understanding the biology, we can implement new forms of treatment, whether that's through medications or through targeted interventional tools like TMS, TDCS, deep brain stimulation, or by finding ways to combine those modern tools to augment the effects even of psychotherapy. And this is work that's already changing our field. And so it's no surprise that one of the major issues with teaching neuroscience is just how new everything is and how rapidly it's expanding. A second major barrier comes at the systems level, and for training programs, that level is all about the ACGME, the the Accreditation Council for Graduate Medical Education. So the ACGME program requirements are now 65 pages long and have more than 20,000 words in them. And if you look through these words, you'll see lots of stuff like must, may, requirement, evaluations, lots of good stuff, every form of therapy there is, different types of clinical exposures, 2 separate references to educating residents on taking naps when they're on call. But does anyone want to guess what word does not appear anywhere in the program requirements? There is no neuroscience required in psychiatry. So if you're keeping score, naps 2, neuroscience 0. This has changed a little bit with the implementation of the Milestones project, which at least acknowledges the existence of neuroscience. But as someone who was involved in helping write the new neuroscience milestone, I can attest that it is still woefully underrepresented in these systems. So if we're imagining a program who wants to implement a new neuroscience curriculum, we're still facing a number of challenges. What do you teach when the field of neuroscience is so vast, there's so much jargon, it's evolving too rapidly to keep up? Where are we going to put it into our already packed curriculum? Who's going to teach it? Maybe you have neuroscience faculty, maybe you don't. I know that I don't here. And most importantly, how do we teach it well? So even if you have strong neuroscientist research faculty, that doesn't necessarily mean that they make the best teachers. So how do we go about this? So if we think about the traditional GME models, historically it's entailed a series of central regulations implemented at the individual level. But for cutting edge content like modern neuroscience, my argument would be that this doesn't work. So the regulatory systems are too complex to adapt quickly to the necessary changes, and designing cutting edge curricula is too resource intensive for any one program to do on its own. So looking forward, we're hoping that the future of graduate medical education will be all about how we work together to achieve our common goals. And the NNCI's central tenet would be that in the same way that cutting edge science requires teamwork and collaboration, so too does cutting edge education. So when we formed the NNCI, our overarching aim was to create a set of open resources that will help improve the teaching of neuroscience in psychiatry. And of course, it's not just about teaching trainees, but how do we integrate a modern neuroscience perspective into every facet of our clinical practice? And so when we first created the NNCI, we started by defining a set of core principles, imagining what these would look like in a classroom setting. We were very much focused on how to teach effectively, how to help people implement this curricula. We knew we needed to have sessions that were involved integrative, patient-centered concepts that were experiential and rooted in principles of adult learning, that were easy to implement even by those of us who don't know any neuroscience, and most of all, fun. So one of our favorite modules besides basic neuroanatomy like Play-Doh brain and cookie brains is the neuroscience in the media course. Because part of what we experience in our field as psychiatrists is things like going out to a party and someone comes up to you and says, "Oh, wow, you're a psychiatrist? Well, I just read this thing about how Tetris cures PTSD. And then that person proceeds to ask you things like, how does this work? And what happens in the brain? And does Dr. Mario work as well as Tetris? And do video games contribute or cure other mental illnesses, et cetera, right? I see nods. So the core learning objective of these neuroscience and the media modules is that residents will be able to serve as ambassadors of neuroscience who can thoughtfully communicate findings from the field to different audiences. So it's not just about what we're doing in the classroom, it's also about how do we talk to different people, including to lay persons, right? Another pressing issue facing our field more than ever is physician burnout and depression. So at the NNCI, we've created Intern Year, which is an educational board game. This is part of a new genre of cooperative games in which the objective is not to win out over the other players, but for all the players to work together to defeat the game itself. So each participant chooses a character with unique skills and attributes, and players then work together to make it through a typical intern year. They work through primary care, night float, neurology, and psychiatry rotations. And as they experience events in the game, they struggle. Some of them may become clinically depressed, and this has real consequences for their characters in the game, up to and including the possibility that a member of the team dies by suicide. And at the end of each rotation, we bring in little nuggets of neuroscience concepts as the participants engage in a reflective group activity around one of these core themes related to physician wellness, like what is stress? What is resilience? What's the difference between burnout and depression? So we're pulling in the neuroscience in this interactive and collaborative way. We have a whole bunch of other classroom teaching modules that you can find on our website. But once we, after working on these classroom resources, we stepped back a bit and thought about a little more. Even if we designed the perfect set of classroom resources, even if we could do 100 hours of neuroscience in the classroom throughout the course of training, this is still only going to be a tiny fraction of what residents get in their several years of training. So then we started thinking about how do we integrate neuroscience into the clinical aspects of our training. One way we've done this is through talking pathways to patients. In this module, we recognize that a lot of the things that we have been saying or have historically said to patients are just not borne out by our current research. Things like chemical imbalances, for example. And we owe it to our patients to be able to explain as best we can what is actually going on and what is the current state of research based on our understanding of neurobiology. So again, residents or trainees are learning through these types of modules how to actually utilize the specific communication and communication scripts to effectively communicate to not just family, friends, but also patients. I'm gonna skip this. Okay, so again, after focusing on the clinical setting teaching for a while, we stepped back again and thought, well, even if we transform our classroom and clinical settings, it turns out that there's a whole wide world out there beyond the walls of the ivory tower and major academic centers, and not just geographically, but we know that our systems of care are evolving. So it's no longer just the lone single psychiatrist practicing on their own. And we no longer need to only think of psychiatry residents as our audience. We realize that we have a much broader audience, medical students, attendings, other physicians, psychologists, APRNs, social workers, patients, and even families. And so our key question now is, how do we engage with this broader audience? How do we bring this material to everyone? So we've attempted to do faculty development This part I think is critical. As y'all said before, there's a lot of jargon, a lot of constructivism here. So even faculty are not necessarily starting from the same point in our knowledge base. And we're asking them to do things like teaching material that's not familiar to them in ways that they're not even used to teaching. So we wanted to support faculty in this as much as possible. We do this through conferences, trainings at various meetings of ADPERT, and now with the Society of Biological Psychiatry. And throughout all of this, we're keeping in mind that our resources need to be accessible for everyone. So you can go to our website at nncionline.org and view and access, utilize all of this content for free, as well as the associated facilitator guides. You'll also find there a series of more than 60 clinical commentaries from published in Biological Psychiatry, each one designed to capture one core concept and make it clear, relevant, and accessible for a broad audience using a narrative approach. And you can think of these as sort of a cross between a moth performance, a TED Talk, and a Pechakucha presentation, if you've ever seen those. So each one is basically designed to present a single delectable bite of neuroscience, one single moment that will make the audience or the reader say, wow, this stuff is really cool. And for those who are more visual or auditory learners, we do the same thing in a series of recorded talks called This Stuff is Really Cool, which is what Dr. Evan Kaiser's Hidden Side of Addiction was. It was a This Stuff is Really Cool talk. And of course, all the things that we've just been talking about were ideas that we conceived before 2020. So then the pandemic started, and we thought, oh, wow, well, what are we going to do if residents get stuck in quarantine for 2 weeks? And we thought, well, what if we could create an online course that could engage residents literally where they're at? And we called it the Quarantine Curriculum. We brought together a team of amazing educators. We made a 14-day experience that could be done all as self-directed learning with additional live sessions available. And it turned out that this was actually even more helpful to medical students than for residents and fellows. So then we started taking our materials in and adapting them to medical student contexts. And then we learned that it's actually not just students and residents, but we also had faculty, psychologists, nurses, social workers from around the world wanting to participate. So this has led us to our most recent adventures, which is Brain 2021 and now Brain 2022. So this is an online course, an online learning experience designed for individuals at all training levels. Could be for medical students, residents, and fellows. We've run this program for various departments across the country, as well as offering a version for practicing psychiatrists and other mental health professionals for CME credit. And the course is designed around a set of resources, as well as a group activity for each session, as well as an assessment tool to determine whether you've learned the concepts for that session. And I think the most innovative part, other than that, it does everything that we're doing. It's engaging, using principles of adult learning, using it in an online space, but it also can take the place of a local instructor. So for those programs who don't have a local instructor or the ability to teach all of the neuroscience content that they would like, they can outsource their teaching to our team of experts in both neuroscience and teaching, and this bypass a lot of the problems that happen with many programs. So that was a lot. I'm sorry. There's just so many things going on. And I wanted at this point to switch gears a little bit and briefly touch on how all this stuff that we just talked about that the NNCI has done over the last many years has spurred similar progress in another crucial area. So I've been fortunate over the last 2 years to be involved with the National Anti-Racism in Medicine Curriculum Coalition, NAMCC, which is a multidisciplinary interprofessional group of people across the nation who are interested in advancing anti-racism curricula in all healthcare professions. So just like the NNCI, the NAMCC was born out of the need to solve pretty big problems at the system level, program levels, as well as at the individual levels. And in fact, in July of this year, the Association of American Medical Colleges, the AAMC, published a set of new competencies for all stages of physician development. So that means at the level of graduating medical school and entering residency, at the level of graduating residency and entering independent practice, and at the level of an experienced faculty physician who's responsible, excuse me, for educating students or residents. So this document actually encompasses a set of competencies for folks at each of those three levels. And they focus on areas of diversity, equity, and inclusion, including anti-racism. So we're thinking, okay, how are experienced faculty supposed to develop these new competencies if that wasn't part of their own training that they got? And historically, faculty development has been a fairly ambiguous term that we use in academic medicine to connote things like attendance at grand rounds, or the occasional department-wide training, or faculty getting CMEs on their own in whatever specialty they practice. And so it's not a very cohesive system. It's pretty flawed. Among other things, COVID-19 created an existential crisis for faculty development as well as medical education broadly. So if the faculty are not able to gather in person, how are we able to do things like build community and continue to learn and grow from one another? And creating a sense of community, especially for new faculty, became a significant challenge. In addition, in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, we found that some faculty were hungry for more resources related to anti-racism and social justice. The sense of isolation, righteous indignation, and a growing realization that students and trainees need to have certain skills, knowledge, and attitudes related to anti-racism, and that faculty needed to have these and model these as well. So we hope to provide a way to structure faculty learning experiences, including a syllabus to support faculty personal journeys in anti-racism, a social context for learning, and safe spaces where people could question, be vulnerable, and learn from their colleagues. So we wanted to combine self-study and social context. And so what we created was anti-racism learning communities among faculty members who were committed to open-mindedness, engagement, and discussion to better understand approaches to anti-racism in healthcare and society. And so for the self-study piece, we actually chose an interactive technology software called Nearpod. And Nearpod has been a pretty popular platform in the K through 12 education space for virtual teaching and learning. The topics that we initially piloted ranged from housing to schools to faculty recruitment and retention to culturally responsive mental health interventions. And these were all first piloted at Georgetown University's Child and Adolescent Psychiatry Division. And it was really out of this pilot that led to the creation via an American Board of Psychiatry and Neurology grant of the NAMCC. The NAMCC now has 4 major arms of the organization and around 100 members that are on our listserv. So the content development and review team meets regularly, reviews, and further develops high quality curriculum materials to support implementation of anti-racism concepts across institutions and for learners at different levels. Our research and dissemination team analyzes our data and works to publish it and make the curriculum accessible to broader audiences. We've recently just submitted a submission to MedEd Portal. The advocacy and ambassadors team works to disseminate the material and to actually teach it and put it into action. So we are forming partnerships with organizations, with individual residency programs. We offer live facilitated courses on anti-racism topics. We also have a course for facilitators to learn how to facilitate in DEI and anti-racism spaces. And then finally, our community of practice is a monthly gathering of all of our members to have a safe place to try out new content, to learn ideas, to read up on new educational things that are going on, to share what we're doing in our own institutions and grow from one another and get ideas and encouragement. So unfortunately, we do not have time today to do a full session from the NAMCC. But what I'm going to do is give you an access code so we can do so you can kind of peruse it a little bit on your own and then discuss it in your small group. So this is an access code to a pared down version of one of our courses, which is on responding to racism from patients. And I'm going to put it in the chat here, this information. You can either scan this QR code to access the module on your own, or just go to nearpod.com, click on join a lesson, and then enter the code BCU3R. So again, if you want to go ahead and access that now, you can pull it up. We don't have time to do it. A full module typically takes anywhere from 20 to 30 minutes to kind of run through. This one is just a pared down version. It starts with a vignette, goes into some resources for you to think more deeply about the concept, as well as give you some examples of actually responding to racism from patients, and then asks you to reflect on the vignette again. So what I'm hoping is that you can actually quickly scan through that when we move you into your breakout rooms in just a sec, and then reflect on that briefly with your colleagues. And the other thing that I was hoping that you could do in your breakouts is, in particular, pay attention to some of the principles of adult learning that we went over earlier, and see if you can recognize any of those being utilized in this module and reflect a little bit more on them. So for this final breakout session, again, we'll give you about 6 minutes. And let me post some discussion questions in the chat. So hopefully you can reflect. You can just log in. You shouldn't need to create an account, I don't think. I think you can just type in any name or nickname that you want on it. When I pull up, sorry, I'm responding to somebody in the chat. It just says type in a name. You can type in whatever name that you want to. It shouldn't actually be a login. If you're on the Nearpod website on nearpod.com, you don't actually have to log in. You can just click on join a lesson and you don't need a login for that. Okay, so reflection questions for breakouts. You're not actually responding to the vignette in the module, but what did you think about it as you clicked through? Did you notice any principles of adult learning in this format? What would it be like if more learning sessions use these principles, and what other topics besides neuroscience or anti-racism DEI topics would you like to see in this way? All right, we are going to go into breakouts one more time. I might move or consolidate people a little bit if there aren't enough people in individual rooms, but I think that we've got it pretty good right now. So we'll go ahead and open the rooms. I think we're all back. I just wanted to make sure to thank everyone for participating. You can check out our websites and additional content at www.nncionline.org and www.namcc.net. Both of them provide absolutely free registration and access to all of our content. We also have time for Q&A if you want to go back and fill out the post-assessment to see and self-assess what you have learned from this session. There is a post-assessment available. The link is on the screen and also in the chat there. Again, I'm not looking at this. This is just for your own self-assessment to see how you did through this session, but otherwise we'll just leave open the last few minutes for questions and answers. Thank you.
Well, I'll just say, Ashley, I appreciate how interactive. This is a great model for interactive teaching and showing some amazing materials that I'm now going to go back and spend some time this weekend taking a look at.
Awesome. I would say that that is an excellent example of self-directed learning. Yes. You're taking it into your own hands in terms of like what you want to get out of this. Perfect.
And it sounds like you're welcoming people to unmute if they want to make a comment.
Yes, for sure.
Thank you, Ashley. This was really super interesting. And I really appreciated how you took two really different topics, neuroscience education and, EDI and anti-racist related work, and kind of threaded the adult learning principles across the two. Because I think also the sort of multiple different examples of how those learning principles could be applied is also a really useful tool in and of itself. And I guess one thing I was reflecting on, which sort of seems obvious, but also seems very critical, especially I think the further along I get in my career, is it's so easy when you're done with school and you're done with training and you're, everything that you then do is about continuing education and so on. It's so easy to kind of, I don't know, just get apathetic about things, or you get busy and you feel unmotivated because you're stressed and all this sort of stuff. But when the learning is interactive and when it, requires responding and whatnot, it sucks you back in. Like it really does make, I think, a very critical difference between like sitting and passively watching something online, for example, and multitasking or doing whatever we all do when we're only halfway engaged, versus like really kind of getting sucked back in and immersed in something. And so it feels like there's actually sort of like exponential benefit. It's obvious that like interaction enhances learning, but it also really like kind of immerses you and gets your brain in an actually very different place, I think, when in terms of how people interact with the material. So I just, it's a good reminder for all of us that there can be so much more to our ongoing education than just kind of like clicking through a screen and meeting a requirement for continuing ed.
Exactly. So there's actually neuroscience data on how there's kind of a U-shaped curve, or I guess an inverted U-shaped curve, on, the level of kind of stress, I guess you could call it, that's optimal for creating learning. So learning really should be like changing, like you start at one place and you are changed, and now you're in a different place. That's what learning is, right? Whether that's knowledge or a skill or whatever it is, you're in a different place from where you started. And the neuroscience is actually that you need a little bit of stress in order to optimize that learning curve, right? If there's too little stress, if you're just sitting there, your screen's off, you're just absorbing somebody talking, right? And there's no interaction, there's no stress involved, that's going to not lead to the best learning. Similarly, if you're too stressed, right? Like, which I think happens to our trainees sometimes, and is something that we need to think about as educators, right? If they're coming off a service or they've had a really stressful clinical encounter, whatever it is, right before they're coming into a didactic session, that also does not create optimal learning, right? So we need to find kind of that in-between balance. Well, I very much appreciate you all. Happy to stick around further if you want, but otherwise, thank you.
We appreciate you too, Ashley. Thank you so much for a great talk and a great modeling.